In everyday life, sensors are everywhere, and they do not always look like cameras or microphones that obviously feel like surveillance. A door badge reader, a motion sensor in a hallway, a smart thermostat, a connected smoke detector, a delivery locker with a keypad, and a retail store's people counter can all create data about human behavior, even when they were installed for safety or convenience. The privacy challenge is that surveillance and Internet of Things, IoT, devices often collect continuously, passively, and at scale, which means they can build detailed records without anyone deliberately choosing to share information. For brand new learners, the surprising part is that overcollection does not require malicious intent because it can happen simply by buying devices with default settings, deploying them broadly, and letting them send data to the cloud. When sensor data is tied to identities, locations, or patterns, it can become personal data, and sometimes it becomes sensitive data very quickly. The goal here is to learn how to evaluate surveillance and IoT sensors in a way that achieves the legitimate purpose, like safety or operational efficiency, without collecting more data than needed or keeping it longer than justified. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful first step is to define what surveillance means in this context, because the word can feel dramatic and confusing. Surveillance is any systematic observation of people, spaces, or behavior that creates records, especially when the observation is ongoing and not limited to a single moment. In privacy work, the key issue is not whether the device is marketed as a surveillance tool, but whether it produces data that can be linked to individuals or used to infer things about them. A sensor might capture images, audio, movement, temperature, Bluetooth signals, Wi-Fi device identifiers, or even patterns like when a door opens and closes. Each of these can become personal data if it can be tied to a person directly, like a face or a badge ID, or indirectly, like a device identifier that consistently appears in the same place. Beginners often assume sensor data is anonymous because it is technical, but repeated signals across time can create identity even without a name. Evaluation starts by asking what the sensor observes, what it records, and how those records could connect to human beings in real life. To evaluate sensors without overcollection, you need to be very clear about purpose, because purpose is what sets the boundary for what is appropriate. A sensor deployed for fire safety has a different data need than a sensor deployed for employee productivity monitoring, and mixing those purposes is a common path to privacy harm. For example, a security camera might be justified for preventing theft in a specific area, but using that same footage to analyze employee performance or customer demographics is a different purpose with different expectations. A workplace badge system might be needed to restrict entry to dangerous areas, but turning badge data into a minute-by-minute attendance tracker changes the nature of processing. Purpose clarity also helps you resist the temptation of collecting extra data just in case, which is a phrase that usually means no clear purpose exists yet. When the purpose is narrow, you can choose a sensor configuration that is narrow as well, and that is the most reliable way to prevent overcollection. The next step is to understand what counts as overcollection, because it is not only about collecting too many types of data. Overcollection can mean collecting data at higher precision than needed, collecting too frequently, collecting in too broad a location, collecting on too many people, or collecting for too long. For example, if you only need to know whether a room is occupied to save energy, you may not need an image of who is in the room, and you may not need to store occupancy events for years. If you need to know how many people enter a retail store per hour, you may not need device identifiers or video that can be used to re-identify repeat visitors. If you need to detect a water leak, you do not need continuous audio. Overcollection is also about context, because a sensor placed in a public lobby has different expectation impacts than a sensor placed in a private break room, a medical waiting area, or a children's play space. Evaluating overcollection means checking whether the sensor collects more detail than the purpose requires and whether there are safer alternatives. A powerful way to reduce overcollection is to prefer the least intrusive sensing method that still meets the operational goal. This often means choosing data that is lower in identifiability and lower in sensitivity. For occupancy, a simple motion sensor might be enough, rather than video analytics that can identify faces or track body movement. For access control, a system might verify authorization without storing detailed movement histories longer than necessary. For security, cameras might be limited to entrances and high-risk areas rather than covering every space by default. For maintenance, sensors might report equipment health metrics without linking those metrics to individual users. Beginners sometimes assume the best sensor is the one with the most features, but privacy-focused evaluation often prefers fewer features because extra features often mean extra data streams. When the least intrusive method is chosen intentionally, you reduce both privacy risk and the security burden of protecting sensitive sensor data. Another important evaluation area is identifiability, which is the degree to which sensor data can be linked to a person. Direct identifiers are obvious, like faces, voices, badge IDs, or license plates. Indirect identifiers are trickier, like device IDs, network addresses, or consistent movement patterns that uniquely match a person even without their name. For example, a phone's Bluetooth signal can become a stable identifier if it is collected repeatedly, and that can allow tracking across spaces. Even aggregated data can become identifiable if the group is small or if patterns are unique, like one person working late hours every day. Evaluation should ask whether the sensor data is designed to avoid identifying individuals when identification is not needed, such as counting without tracking or detecting presence without recording images. It should also ask whether the system combines sensor data with other datasets, because linking is what often turns low-risk signals into high-risk profiles. A key privacy skill is spotting how harmless data becomes personal when combined with other sources. Transparency matters in surveillance and IoT because passive collection can feel unfair if people do not know it is happening. In many contexts, people cannot meaningfully opt out of being observed in a space, such as a workplace, a school, a store, or an apartment building lobby. That makes it even more important to provide clear notice, explain purpose, and limit collection to what is truly needed. Notice is not only a sign on the wall, although signage can be part of it, but also communication through policies, onboarding materials, and clear explanations from the organization. Beginners sometimes assume privacy is solved if a sign exists, but a sign does not prevent overcollection, and it does not make unrelated secondary uses acceptable. Transparency should include what is collected, why it is collected, who receives it, and how long it is kept, in language that matches the audience. In a workplace, transparency should also address power dynamics, because employees may feel they cannot refuse, and that affects fairness. Evaluation includes asking whether the organization can justify the sensor use in a way that a reasonable person would consider proportionate and respectful. Retention and access control are especially important for sensor data, because sensors can generate large volumes of information and because the data can be revealing when viewed over time. A single video clip may show little, but weeks of footage can show routines, relationships, and sensitive habits. A single door entry event may be innocuous, but months of logs can show who meets whom and when. Evaluation should ask what data is stored by default, what can be stored optionally, and what retention period is actually enforced, including backups and vendor systems. It should also ask who can access sensor data, how access is logged, and whether access is limited to specific roles with a clear need. Beginners may assume only security staff can view camera footage, but in some organizations footage spreads to managers, contractors, or even external vendors for troubleshooting. The more people who can access the data, the greater the risk of misuse, misunderstanding, or accidental disclosure. Service provider risk is often central to IoT privacy because many devices rely on cloud platforms that collect, store, and analyze data outside the organization deploying the sensors. A connected camera might upload footage to a provider's platform. A smart lock might store access logs in the cloud, and a sensor network might send telemetry to a vendor for analytics and maintenance. Evaluation must consider what the vendor does with the data, whether they use it for their own purposes, whether they share it with subprocessors, and whether they provide strong deletion and retention controls. It also must consider where data is stored and processed, because cross-border data handling can introduce legal and operational complexity. Another important question is whether the device can function in a privacy-preserving mode, such as local processing or limited cloud reliance, because that can reduce exposure. Beginners sometimes focus only on the device in the room and forget the entire backend ecosystem that may be collecting far more than the device's owner realizes. When cloud is involved, measurable controls and ongoing monitoring become essential. Security is inseparable from privacy in sensor systems because IoT devices are often deployed widely and can be difficult to manage. Weak security can lead to unauthorized viewing of video feeds, manipulation of sensors, or harvesting of device identifiers and logs. Evaluation should consider whether devices receive updates, whether default credentials are eliminated, whether communications are protected, and whether device access is restricted. It should also consider how devices are decommissioned, because old sensors can remain connected and continue sending data even after they are no longer needed. Another issue is that sensor systems can create new entry points into networks, which can expand the attack surface beyond privacy concerns. Even if the organization intends to use sensor data responsibly, a breach can expose it to people who have no legitimate reason to see it. A privacy-aware evaluation asks whether the organization can realistically secure the sensor deployment at the scale planned, because an insecure sensor system is not only a technical risk, but also a trust risk. One of the hardest judgment calls for beginners is evaluating whether a sensor use is proportionate, especially in spaces where people have reduced choice. Proportionate means the sensing method and scope match the legitimate need and do not create excessive intrusion. For example, using cameras to protect a high-value warehouse entrance may be proportionate, while installing cameras in private rest areas would be excessive in most contexts. Using occupancy sensors to manage building energy may be proportionate, while using facial recognition to track every person's movement through a store is far more intrusive and raises additional ethical and fairness concerns. Proportionate evaluation includes considering alternatives, such as using anonymized counts instead of tracking individuals, or limiting sensing to certain times or areas. It also includes considering the impact of mistakes, because sensors can generate false positives that affect people, such as incorrectly flagging suspicious behavior or triggering disciplinary action. When a system can harm people through errors or misinterpretation, the privacy and fairness risk rises sharply. A careful evaluation asks not only what the sensor can do, but what people might do with its outputs. It also helps to think about secondary use and function creep, because sensor deployments are especially prone to expanding beyond their original purpose. A system installed for safety can slowly become a system used for productivity monitoring, marketing analysis, or behavioral profiling, especially if the data is already available. Function creep often starts with a seemingly reasonable request, like using existing footage to investigate a minor policy violation, then grows into routine monitoring. The risk is that people were never informed or given a chance to understand the new use, and the organization may not have assessed the broader impact. Evaluation should include controls that limit secondary use, such as policies, technical restrictions, and approval processes for new purposes. It should also include periodic reviews to confirm that the deployment still matches its original justification and that data is not being repurposed quietly. Beginners should learn that the easiest way to prevent function creep is to avoid collecting high-risk data in the first place when it is not necessary. If the data does not exist, it cannot be misused later. To make evaluation practical, you can use a simple mental framework that ties together purpose, data, people, and life cycle. Purpose asks why the sensor exists and what decision or action it supports. Data asks what the sensor collects, how identifiable it is, and whether it is more precise than needed. People asks who is affected, who can access the data, and whether vulnerable groups are involved or choice is limited. Lifecycle asks how long data is kept, how it is deleted, what happens when devices are replaced, and how changes are governed over time. This framework helps you move beyond abstract fear of surveillance and into concrete risk reasoning. It also helps you identify the most effective risk controls, which are often minimization, scope limitation, strong access control, short retention, and strict limits on secondary use. When those controls are measurable and enforced, sensor systems can support safety and operations without turning into broad, quiet data collection engines. Evaluating surveillance and IoT sensors without overcollection is ultimately about discipline, because technology will always offer the option to collect more than you need. A privacy-minded evaluator insists on a clear purpose, chooses the least intrusive method, and limits identifiability when identification is not required. They check how data flows to vendors and whether vendor controls match the sensitivity of the data. They set retention boundaries and make sure access is limited and logged, because sensor data becomes more revealing with time and exposure. They demand transparency that respects the reality that people often cannot opt out of being in a space, so the burden shifts to the organization to be fair and proportionate. And they watch for function creep, because sensor data is tempting to reuse once it exists. If you can keep collection tight, keep purposes narrow, and keep controls measurable, you can benefit from sensors without building a surveillance system that exceeds what people would reasonably expect.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.